Coming up on today's programme. This was the scene in Dover a short while ago following the news that 5 people, including a child, have died while trying to cross the channel.
As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary not content. The contents have it.
It comes after Parliament approved the Rwanda Bill late last night.
I want the planes to take off as quickly as possible because that will help us to stop the boats.
The Rwanda scheme is an extortionately expensive gimmick.
Just this morning, the BBC films more migrants boarding boats on the French coast. So will the bill actually work? Rishi Sunak pledges more money for Ukraine. Will it help turn the tide in the war?
We're going to ease the transition to electric vehicles.
We won't reach the 28 billion, which is effectively stood down.
This Parliament's interim 2030 target is out of reach.
All parties have watered-down green pledges. So do we need more realistic climate targets? And are English politicians too squeamish about their national identity? To discuss all that, I'm joined by Conservative MP and former Minister Tobias Ellwood, Shadow Defence Minister Luke Pollard, Green Party MP Caroline Lucas and Daily Telegraph Associate Editor Camilla Tominey. This is Politics Live. Well, as you heard there in the headlines, this morning 5 migrants have died trying to cross the channel in a small boat in the wake of the bill designed to deter people making that crossing. Well, that bill passed both Houses of Parliament last night. We can talk to the BBC reporter Simon Jones, who is in Dover. Simon Jones, can you bring us up to date with what's been happening at the coast?
Yeah, it's been another really busy day out there in the Channel. Hardly surprising. When you look out there, it is very calm. You can see France in the distance. Perfect conditions for making these types of crossings. In the past hour or so, we've seen the border force bring 2 groups of migrants back to shore. We reckon around 130 people. And currently, the Dover lifeboat is down there. It has picked up another group of migrants, probably a similar number. So we're looking at 200 people having arrived already so far today, but also today we've discovered once again how dangerous these crossings can be, with news that 5 people lost their lives attempting the journey in the early hours. A boat set off from a beach in Wimereux, which is just along the coast from Calais in northern France towards Boulogne. Now we're told that boat had 112 people on board, which actually I've never heard that many people on board a single boat. It got into trouble when it got grounded on a sandbank. And then, as people were trying to relaunch that boat, in the scramble that followed, people ended up in the water. 5 people lost their lives. But we're told, although half the people on board that boat agreed to be rescued, around 50 decided no, they would carry on their journey to the UK. So a sign of how desperate people are to get to this side of the Channel.
Simon Jones, thank you very much for talking to us there from Dover. And as you say, the numbers are quite extraordinary. It has been a busy morning. We can also talk to my colleague, Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons. He's been at the Calais shoreline all morning. We've been hearing about what's been happening in Dover. You've been filming there all morning. What have you seen, Tom?
Well, Joe, 2 incidents really on this side of the Channel. The first, ably described there by Simon, down at Wimereux, which is between the Touquet and Calais. But we were on a beach just north of Calais at an area called Gravelines, which is very close to many of the camps where the migrants live here on the French coast, a beach that we've been told was regularly used for departures. And sure enough, as we watched, a boat with about half full of people came in towards the shore, and then as we watched, about 40 people came from the dunes where I think they'd been hiding, kind of walked quickly across the beach towards this boat, and as you can see, then tried to get onto the boat. Now, the police were there. In fact, they came and challenged us. They actually said that they accused us of knowing where these migrants were going to launch from, and of kind of sort of being there in preparation, which is not true. We just went to a beach that was used in the past. And it's interesting, they stopped migrants going to the boats, but once they got to the boat, they didn't try to stop that boat leaving. And we know that in the past they have use knives to stab inflatable boats so they can't be launched out to sea. And that boat did manage to get its little outboard engine working and then headed out towards the UK. But there was a large French naval vessel tracking all of this and a spotter plane overhead. So we don't know if it made it across. Interesting that Simon has seen some 70 people arriving in Dover. But certainly that was another successful departure from the French coast within hours of the Rwanda Bill passing.
Well, and we've just been looking at the pictures that you have taken all morning on the Calais coast, which clearly illustrate everything you have just said, Tom. In terms of the Rwanda Bill, you've been talking to people there on the ground. Are people aware of it?
That's an interesting question, Joe. Yes, we stopped at a little encampment area. People tend to camp in their nationality groups, and so we stopped and talked to a group of Somali migrants and some South Sudanese migrants and asked them about Rwanda. They had heard of this change in the law. They knew a little bit about it, but not the details. So they then started asking me questions about how the Rwanda plan that the government has announced would work. Some of them did not seem to know that if they made it to the UK and were taken to Rwanda, there was no option for them to apply for asylum in the UK. It would be for asylum in Rwanda. When I told them that, certainly eyebrows raised and there were concerned discussions. But nobody said that this would change their intention of getting to the UK. In fact, one migrant told me if he got to the UK and attempts were made to remove him to Rwanda, he would try to kill himself. So that is what the government is dealing with. And I think the problem is for the people who've got as far as France, they've already invested considerable money potentially and certainly time and effort in getting there. Some journeys take 6, 7, 8 months, some of them even longer. And the conditions in the camp are not good. The French police move people quite regularly.
Yes.
The weather is bad. There are very few amenities. So that's the problem for the government in trying to dissuade them.
Tom Simons, thank you very much there, reporting from Calais. You've heard what Tom said there, Tobias. He said the people he's spoken to, obviously anecdotal, and from today, nobody said it would change their minds, the fact that they would risk deportation to Rwanda, where they would have their application processed in order to stay in Rwanda rather than here. With that in mind, is it going to work, this, as a deterrent?
Yes, we want it to work. It's part of a wider package of measures. You're seeing greater collaboration with the French. This is one aspect that we've seen today with these people launching because of the good weather. But actually,
112, never seen so many, said our reporter there.
Because of the fair weather conditions. But overall, we're seeing greater collaboration with France. We're seeing a wider package of measures taking place. Absolutely, this Rwanda Bill has been difficult. 4 months' worth of toing and froing. And it's overshadowed not just other legislation to scrutinise, but also the other aspects of tackling this issue of illegal migration. And I should add that Albania is a great example to compare to. The message didn't get through yet. I know it's different. We have a returns agreement. But the message didn't get through to Albanians. Don't bother coming this way because the system was working. It will take time for this to get to be in place. But I should stress that this is one element. It's been totemically placed up there as this being be-all and end-all. It is not.
By the government mainly.
It
no,
needs to
but
be
I take your
tackling
point.
the gangs, working with France, and more importantly, at source. You heard that the journey...
Because I've got to get round everybody on this key question, will it work as a deterrent?
No, it won't. It's an expensive gimmick.
You know that.
It's not going to work. At best, it will deal with 1% of migrants coming over the channel. We've just heard of the amount of people coming over today equals basically the amount that the government hopes to send to Rwanda.
But that's different from it acting as a deterrent to them making the crossing in the first place.
So if you have a chance of 1%, you might go to Rwanda, 99% that you won't hear. I mean, the people are dying going across the channel in awful conditions, being aided by a cruel and vile smuggling gang industry. We need to smash the gangs. I'm afraid the effort that has gone into this gimmick from ministers, the sheer amount of money, £500 million, £2 million per migrant being sent to Rwanda, and no one has yet gone. No planes have taken off. It isn't working. It won't work. It's expensive and it's cruel. What we need to use that money to smash the gangs, to make sure that we're dealing with this massive backlog in processing and asylum claims, having proper return agreements so we can get people who have no right to be in the UK away from our shores and making sure we're working with our international partners. That's not happening at the moment at the pace it needs to.
We've glossed over that because of the focus all on the Rwanda Bill. This is actually happening. Absolutely, it's absolutely happening. And we need to make sure that we then share that information and understanding. This system is yet to be in place. Once it is in place, it will act as that deterrent.
When you say
and
once it's in place,
if I just
very
stress,
briefly.
The United Nations has also sent people to Rwanda. Denmark has the same legislation that we've just passed in place. And France and Germany are looking as well because they're actually dealing with a larger asylum seeker situation than we are here in the UK.
Do you think it'll work? Rishi Sunak has said that he hopes the first flight will take off in July, so still some time off, and that after that, the number of people making that dangerous crossing that we have seen illustrated this morning will begin to diminish. Do you agree?
No, I think this is an act of performative cruelty. I think it's illegal, it's immoral, and indeed it is unworkable. And on the issue of deterrence, let's just remember what some of these people have already put themselves through, even just to get to the coast of France before they then put their lives at risk with the trafficking across the channel. If you've only got a 1% chance of being sent to Rwanda, you've already been dealing with so many other chances and risks that you're weighing up in your mind. If you've gone halfway around the world already, put your life at risk so many times already, then the idea that you've got a 1% chance of going to Rwanda, I think is very unlikely to deter you. What we need to be doing is putting in place safe and legal routes. Nobody wants to see the type of tragedy that we've just seen again this morning. It is horrific that people are feeling that that is the only solution that they have. If we had safe routes, if people would apply from outside of the UK, people wouldn't have to put their lives at risk in this way in the first place.
Do you think it'll work as a deterrent?
I've no idea. Although they're obviously looking to the Australian example. I mean, when Tony Abbott introduced his sovereign borders scheme, it did stop the boats. And migrants were processed in, I think, Nauru and the Manus Islands.
Again,
and it has proved a deterrent.
It's not the same as the sort
It's
of
not the
system
same,
that...
but it's, I mean, it's a bit of a test case, isn't it, for comparison? Also, I note that the Labour government, when it came in under Albanese, didn't reverse the measures. I mean, it's interesting to hear that Labour are now saying that they would want to scrap this scheme, what, after everything that's just happened over the course of the last 4 months. Also, two questions, one for Luke and one for Caroline. What does smash the gangs mean? Because this is a cross-European network of criminals. I mean, the police do a great job, but in what world can we, quote, smash the gangs? How does that happen? And second of all, for Caroline, when you talk about safe and legal routes, how many numbers are you talking about? You're going to offer safe and legal routes to how many people?
All right.
Because we've currently got migrants housed in hotels at £9 million a day,
Let them respond. How do you smash the gangs?
Well, we have to put the effort that's going into the Rwanda scheme into creating that cross-border police unit with a determination to smash the gangs, to go against their business model that fundamentally is not just about that last little bit of water between ourselves and France. It is about that criminal network, which means we have to enhance our collaboration and cooperation with our friends in Europe to make sure that we're dealing with the whole business model here. But to do that, a good deterrent would also be to remove that backlog, to make it clear to people that if you come to the UK, your claim will be processed swiftly and we'll have 1,000 extra caseworkers to remove that backlog, 1,000 extra people in a returns unit to get people who have no right to be in the UK off our shores. Now, that is a proper practical plan. That is an approach which will have a difference. I don't think Rwanda's going to work. I don't think at the heart of it, the government thinks Rwanda's going to work. Rishi Sunak tried to sink the scheme when he was the Chancellor because he didn't think it was going to work then. So it is just a gimmick. It's not dealing with the root cause, which is the gang.
But let's do the safe routes. How many safe routes would you want to have from how many countries?
Well, I think let's look at where people are coming from. An awful lot of people are coming right now from Afghanistan, and there is supposed to be a legal route, and I can tell you that that is not working. So it's
there is a legal route, but whether it's working is
well, I can tell you because I've got constituents, people who have been linked, for example, in my case, to the University of Sussex. They were involved in the so-called Chevening programme, a Foreign Office programme of advancing British values. They worked with the British government for many years. They were left waiting in Afghanistan in spite of this so-called safe and legal route.
So you'd want a different.
So I would want it to be functional. So it's not just a question of having the.
And then from countries in Africa, perhaps.
I think you need to look at where people are coming from. The top 5 places people are coming from are places like Vietnam at the moment because of human trafficking. You've got Afghanistan, you've got Iran and Syria. Let us look at where people are coming from and where those asylum applications are being upheld. Over 85% of those applications are being upheld because people have a legal right to be here. But let us just remember, this is a global problem. Most refugees stay very close to the country that they're from. So actually, Europe as a whole, and still less the UK, has to deal with a relatively small number. If we could just have some global cooperation, if we could have had, for example, the kinds of arrangements that we once had with the European Union, we would be able to have a fair and reasonable way of dealing with what is a global problem. But for as long as we are fixated on what is essentially a cruel programme, something that the Home Secretary himself barely 6 months ago, I think, was reported as saying was batshit. It's not going to work.
James Cleverly, you're talking
James
about.
Cleverly. Tobias himself is on record of saying some things there about the fact that it is ridiculous to say that we are going to legislate that Rwanda is safe.
Let Tobias respond to that.
There's more than unites us than divides us here, because I think you're leading to the fact that we need to focus more at source with what's going on across Africa and elsewhere.
But that's a longer term. That is a longer term plan, isn't it?
It shouldn't be a longer term plan. We are starting to do this now and waking up.
So
Sudan. Let me finish. I listen patiently. Sudan. We had a statement yesterday, an urgent question on Sudan, and that is the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world now. There's going to be an outbreak of famine there. Where will these people go when they can't be fed or can't find food there and water? Climate change, which I think we may be discussing a bit later, that's going to have a massive effect on the whole of Africa. So it needs to be absolutely collaboration, not just with Europe, but wider scale as well. And Britain needs to be leading on that front.
All right,
I stress again that France, Germany, Italy and so forth are receiving more asylum seekers than we are. It needs to be a collective effort. We are doing more because we've spent so much time talking about Rwanda. We don't do enough to say what we're actually doing and achieving on tackling the criminal.
Well, as you say, that might be the government's fault.
And the application process is being sped up as well.
Let's talk about defence. We are going to move on to something, well, maybe related, but also different. The Prime Minister has actually arrived in Poland with Jeremy Hunt. You can see him there, and the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, the three of them arriving to meet the Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, and the Secretary-General of the NATO Defence Alliance, as the Prime Minister and the government promises more money to Ukraine. In the headline here in the Daily Telegraph, Britain to send record military aid to Kyiv to help Ukraine keep the lights on. Pledges £500 million in extra equipment, including air defence missiles, to thwart Russia's bombardment of power stations. This money is on top of the £2.5 billion allocated in this financial year. Luke, will it help turn the tide for Ukraine?
I think if Western allies cooperate and collaborate together, then there's a chance to giving Ukraine the fighting chance it needs to deter that Russian aggression. But
collaborate on money in terms of more money from European countries?
It's not only more money, but it's making sure that money is spent well. So after the past few months where the US has been debating whether to support Ukraine, even though Ukrainian security is American security, it's Western security, we've now got the opportunity with money going to Ukraine to make sure that actually they're getting the resources they need. But I worry about this a wee bit because we know that in the past, not all the government's commitments on the amount of money has been matched by actually spending that money because we haven't mobilised our supply chain, we haven't constructed enough weapon platforms, our supply chain and our stockpiles are too empty to not only support our own resource, our own needs, but also those of Ukraine. So we've got to motor that industrial base to actually produce the 155 shells, the missiles that we need, especially when you see the bombardment that Ukraine is under from Russia, why they're going after civilian targets, and the desperate need for air defence. That's equipment that the US, European allies and Britain should be supporting Ukraine with, but that only works if we put our money where our mouth is and make sure our industrial base is able to deliver on it.
Will the British contribution help?
Absolutely, but we need to recognise the scale of the threat that we're facing. Putin is now the most powerful man in Europe, more powerful than Stalin, and he is on a mission to emulate what Stalin did by pressing ahead and influence across Eastern Europe. He won't stop in Ukraine unless he is stopped. But he is outgunning Ukraine 5-1 in the missiles and the drone attacks that are actually taking place. So the contribution that we're giving absolutely will help. The hesitance by the United States has not helped whatsoever. Same with Germany as well, in being slow on their missile systems too. If we want Ukraine to win, then we need to do what it takes to win. If not, then we should then stop. Because at the moment, we're just delaying the potential for Russia to have a summer offensive. And as I state, Putin will not stop there. The world is splintering, from my perspective, over the next 10 years into two spheres of competing influence, because what sits behind Russia increasingly is China, and Iran and Russia are working together as well. This means we do need to increase defence spending. The additional spending here actually takes us up to 2.3%. But absolutely, there's more and more voices saying, look where the world's going over the next 10 years. We need to prepare.
But the pledge is 2.5% when resources allow. But the way you two are speaking, it sounds like you believe it should be right now. Do you support this extra money and extra spending on defence?
I support the money that's going to Ukraine, for sure. I think Tobias is absolutely right. These are incredibly dangerous times. And what worries me, in a sense, is that until now we seem to have been giving enough support to mean that Ukraine doesn't lose, but not enough to ensure that they win. And so we're dragging out the horror of what is unfolding on our doorstep, more or less. So, yes, I do think it's right that that money goes to Ukraine. But when it comes to budgets more broadly, I think, in a way, it is a link back to the conversation we were just starting to have a moment ago about how we define security. And I would want to see, within that spending, a larger amount going to some of the root causes of insecurity. And as Tobias himself was saying, a lot of that is around the climate emergency, for example. It's no coincidence, I think, that 6 of the top 10 risks that have been identified by the World Economic Forum are around environment, around climate, around nature, when it comes to depleted soils, famines, the kind of chaos that we know that climate change is going to bring.
But that's about priorities and choices. And the politicians seem to be very wedded to the idea of spending much more on defence. Caroline is in favour of it on Ukraine. But beyond that, can we afford this extra spending?
Good question. Can we afford not to have the extra spending is the question. I found it interesting after the budget. You know, Jeremy Hunt's touring TV studios, I interviewed him and I sort of said, aren't you going to up defence spending? And he said, well, we must be prudent and we must, you know, act in the national interest on the budgetary concerns. And I kind of thought, well, with the picture that Tobias has outlined there, and let's not forget that Putin is currently spending 7.5% of Russian GDP on defence, that actually there's nothing less prudent than not upping our own defences at this time.
Could we also just say something about international aid, though? Because I do worry that international aid used to be something that Britain was very proud of, and we had a good story to tell about that. And now we're seeing it being cut and cut. And if we are serious about addressing some of the root causes of insecurity, then it seems to me that to be cutting our aid budget right now is not the right way forward.
But cutting aid and climate change had nothing to do with Putin invading Ukraine.
They have everything to do with the security risks that face us and many other people across the
world. I know, but
we're
identifying security risks mainly, if Tobias is to be believed, and he knows his onions as a former soldier, but also somebody who worked in the Ministry of Defence. The threat is coming from Russia, China and Iran.
The threat is also coming, as I've just explained, from the source of the World Economic Forum. 6 of the top 10 risks to people overall in the world are coming from environment, nature and climate. So I'm just
on the priorities.
I just think it's important that we take the British people with us, because often it's defence spending is often seen as something for what we do. It's wars of choice and so forth. No, the Red Sea indicated how UK's economy can be affected if we are not doing our bit to provide security, global security, because we're so globally exposed in our supply chains.
Right.
Likewise with those grain ships coming out of Odessa. If we don't step forward and encourage others to do so as well, then bad people, authoritarian regimes will take advantage of that vacuum that we lead. That's the world that we're now entering, which is why it's in our interests to increase defence spending, because there won't be any money for health, for education, for all these other things. Because our overall
how do you take people with you? And this would be the government now. And well, hang on a second. Let me just show all of you and our guests, viewers rather, this graph, because it shows very clearly, in terms of, you've just said, defence spending is one of those things that people just think happens to some extent, separate to everything else. Now, 2 lines there. Defence is the red line, health is the line underneath. And you can see broadly from the mid-1950s, much more was spent on defence right up until pretty well the end of the Cold War, when what we call the peace dividend meant that health spending started to increase dramatically over defence right up until 2022. Are you being honest with voters about how much would need to be spent in order to bring defence capability up to the sort of levels you're talking about to meet the challenges of countries like Russia and Iran at the moment, without cutting health, for example?
We've been complacent since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Okay, we've reduced defence spending because there's not been a threat. That threat has returned in many forms. That's what's actually happening now. So absolutely, it's now time to expand our defence budgets.
At the price of what, though?
At the price of, if you don't do it, then all the budgets will be affected because our economy will be hit.
Right.
Our security and our economy have a symbiotic relationship. That needs to be understood by absolutely everybody, whether you're in the Treasury.
So you're going to... Would you spend less on health?
Sorry?
Just for example, would you spend less on health? Would you spend less on schools? Something has to give, doesn't it?
Of course it does, but we're not going to be able to discuss that or come to agreement with that now. What we need to do is make the case to say that absolutely there'll be a lot less to spend.
Yes, but what do you think? Where would you cut it? If you're saying you've got to have an honest conversation with people and with voters and with your constituents,
this needs to be considered in a strategic form. The idea we can somehow come with the answer here today. There was a poll done, I think, in the Daily Express that said, would people be interested in paying a little bit more tax or foregoing tax cuts in order to spend on defence, given what's coming over the horizon? And absolutely, they were in favour of that. So there are other methods of ensuring that we advance our defence posture.
But you could be working in precisely this area if Labour win the election, rather, in government. What would you cut?
Well, Keir set out the first duty of any government is to protect the nation. And in opposition, we can't see the classified intelligence that puts where we would put what spending at what time. What we have set out is we'll have a defence review on day one of a Labour government that will set out where the challenges are and what are the resources and equipment needed to meet that challenge. But also we can change what we spend in defence. And so at the moment, we spend far too much on foreign contracts where that money could be spent on British companies, creating more jobs in the UK, having a direct straight line correlation between the defence budget and the taxes that are paid into the Treasury to support all public services. And with an economy that hasn't had the growth that we need, because effectively...
You're relying on growth coming to pay for it.
I think defence could contribute to that growth by spending more on British companies first, rather than buying American and foreign equipment off the shelf as a preference, because that would create more skills, more jobs and more taxes being paid in the UK. And the defence industries we have as a country tend not to be located in the City of London. They tend to be located right around the country in places like Plymouth that I represent, places that don't get other types of big industrial investment. So it supports regional growth and addresses regional inequality as well.
Right. Do you admit also there has to be an honest conversation with people about the trade-offs? Because there would have to be trade-offs.
We have to have an honest conversation. I think the element that I would introduce into the conversation, which has been singularly lacking so far, is where else we can raise revenue from. And of course, Labour is refusing to go anywhere near the idea of some kind of wealth tax. The Green Party is perfectly upfront to say that those people who are on very high incomes could be paying more. Why do we also have a situation where income is taxed so much and assets are not? Let's have that honest conversation. We need to have that conversation because at the moment there are huge numbers of callings on all of our budgets. You know, we know that the NHS has the huge waiting list, the education, our schools are crumbling. Climate, I want to put more money into that. So of course we need that conversation. But let's make sure as part of that we're also talking about revenue raising as well as simply about cuts, because we can't do any more cuts.
Green's top priority for spending, if you had a wealth tax, wouldn't be defence, would it?
It would be security. You seem to be very obsessed with the very narrow definition of security in terms of a defence budget and more missiles and more bullets. I would certainly say that security in its broadest form would be absolutely one of our priorities.
But the party has changed its policy with regards UK membership of NATO, hasn't it? It used to be opposed, and that's changed, hasn't it?
It has changed.
Why?
Yes. Because, as Tobias said, the world is an awful lot more dangerous right now. Longer term, we would love to see us move towards an organisation that was more like the OSCE, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a wider grouping. We certainly don't like the fact that NATO has a first-use nuclear capacity. We would want to change that. But ultimately, right now, we recognise that it's not the time to be suggesting that we leave NATO.
Well, let's continue with the theme of climate, at least, because as you saw in the headlines at the beginning of the programme, there have been a few examples of politicians recently from different parties watering down their targets and policies on climate change. Let's take a look.
The test should be, do we have the fairest credible path to reach net zero by 2050 in a way that brings people with us? Now, since I've become Prime Minister, I've examined our plans, and I don't think they meet that test.
We won't reach the 28 billion, which is effectively stood down. I think most people understand that adjusting a plan when the circumstances change, here the damage to the economy, is a perfectly sensible thing to do.
This Parliament's interim 2030 target is out of reach. We must now act to chart a course to 2045 at a pace and a scale that is feasible, fair and just.
Well, that was the Scottish Government there. Finally, are those climate targets, because we heard there from both the Government, Labour and finally the Scottish Government, are they just unrealistic?
No, I don't think they're unrealistic. I think the difficulty is that the effort into delivering the targets hasn't been there, and that's been exactly the problem in Scotland, where you started talking about the Scottish Greens obviously being in an arrangement with the SNP and the Scottish Government. The targets that were set for the Scottish Parliament were set in 2019 before Greens joined the government. When they joined the government a couple of years later, then there simply hadn't been enough work done to mean that we're focusing on the delivery. So it's very easy to set.
But they were unrealistic then to start with. I mean, that's the sort of logic, because scrapping plans to reduce carbon emissions in Scotland by 75% by 2030. Was it ever achievable?
Well, I would argue that it was achievable if you were to treat climate with the same degree of seriousness and urgency with which we would treat a conventional military threat, for example. And so, in a sense, I think what we're dealing with here is the difference between what is judged to be politically possible and what is actually being scientifically necessary. We need to bring those two things together, and that means changing the definition of what is politically possible, looking at, for example, what happened in the run-up to the Second World War and during it, where industries were turned on a sixpence to suddenly producing different kinds of products.
Right.
We had a massive whole society approach to dealing with a very real perceived threat. What we need is that same degree of urgency, and we're not seeing that anywhere, frankly.
Camilla, do you agree with Caroline? It's about the failure to commit to delivering targets, or are they unachievable and unrealistic?
I think they're unachievable and unrealistic. And I think that politicians have a tendency to put the finger in the air and say 2030, 2035, 2045. Also, I'm not sure why, when we talk about having to take the public with you, there isn't a bit more of a kind of 80-20 approach. So say if you talk about the ban on petrols and diesels, an alternative way of doing it might have been to encourage everyone into hybrid cars. 80% of their journeys are then charged at home. 20% when they have to go further afield are petrol, but we've done 80% better than we were doing. But instead it's all bans, stop, arbitrary targets, and you can't take the public with you in that regard, because quite understandably they're very worried about the ultimate cost of this. I still can't get any politician, by the way, to answer the question of how much will it actually cost taxpayers to decarbonise Britain by 2030, 2045, 2050. We can never get an answer to this question.
It depends on, the reason you can't get an answer to that question is because it depends on too many different variables, how fast you're going to do it and what way you're going to do it. I suggest you look at the Committee on Climate Change's reports, which have a lot of data around that. But what I can tell you is that the cost of not tackling the climate crisis, and there has been evidence after evidence on this, is going to be hugely greater. Where I will agree with you, if we're going to bring people with us, then absolutely the finance needs to be up front in order to enable people to make the transition. So on the famous issue of shifting to lower polluting cars, then a more generous scrappage scheme should certainly have been part of that transition. Otherwise, there will be a small number, but nonetheless, for the number that it affects, it's a real issue. Otherwise, they will be disadvantaged from that. So social justice, fairness, has to be at the heart of the environmental transition.
Because CO2 emissions now, I understand, are lower in the UK than they were in 1879. So we are making progress. Sometimes some of this talk, it doesn't take into account for how much the British public have done since awareness was made. Well, I do look at the science, but I'm just talking, you're sort of speaking this kind of very doomsday negative way, as if we haven't made any progress on this issue at all.
I'm not talking about doomsday.
We've made huge amounts of progress. Meanwhile, China has pumped out more CO2 in the last 8 years than Britain has since the Industrial Revolution.
Can I reply to that?
So we need to be realistic in response to the voters being taken forward with these policies.
All right. Can I say, first of all, on China, that a lot of the emissions in China are actually associated with creating products that we then import into our country. So a lot of our decarbonisation has been at the expense of Can I just finish? Has been at the expense of outsourcing our emissions and production to countries like China. I will agree with you, this shouldn't be a doom and gloom story, because there are huge opportunities here for investing in a greener future. Why wouldn't we want a situation where people's homes were properly insulated, something which this Tory government has managed to fail to do over 14 years? They've not even been able to introduce a home insulation programme on a street-by-street basis that would ensure that people's fuel bills were lower and ensure that they had more money to put on the table for food and other things.
Right,
So
let me...
There is a real good news story here that we could be pursuing. But when Camilla says, we've made lots of progress, what really matters, we've made some progress, what really matters is how much is still there to be done. If we are still on course for a world that is going to be heating by 2.5 or 3 degrees, then it doesn't matter how much we've done. What matters is how much there's still left to do, and therefore we need urgency.
How disappointing was it when Rishi Sunak decided to delay the ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 5 years and pushing back the net zero goals, and then the same with Labour in terms of saying they were going to commit to £28 billion a year on investing in climate change policies? It's now going to be £5 billion extra, this is. What does that do?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very difficult decision. It's put us in alignment with what France and Germany were doing. That was the trouble, is that we were actually trying to pioneer ahead, and it was then infecting our economy. This is Camilla's point, is that you have to take the nation with you. We've had a good story to say so far, but we need to absolutely go further. We've cut our emissions since 2010 by 40%. I looked this morning at the National Grid Live. 35 gigawatts was required for electricity, 35% was gas generated. The rest was very much generated by clean energy. But we need to do more. We've got modular nuclear reactors coming online, more offshore wind farms.
But just as a principle, are targets worthwhile? If they're not going to be reached, if they become unachievable because there isn't the commitment to achieve them, is there any point in having them?
Well, that top target hasn't disappeared of 2050. Yeah. What we may need to consider is what are the interim targets. I did pose this question to the last Environment Minister. And if we're going to go down the route, it probably requires a collective cross-party agreement, because otherwise it does become this political football.
Luke?
Well, I think the 2050 target is still the right target for us to have. And it's not just about carbon, it also needs to be about nature as well, because taking people with us, it's much easier for people to understand what a tree and poo in rivers looks like.
Well, sewage in rivers is a huge issue.
Then it is necessary to talk about the tonnes of carbon. And that's why we've set out not only a green prosperity plan that deals with decarbonisation, a clean grid by 2030, more jobs in renewable offshore industries to be able to cope with that, but also set out plans to take people with us on nature as well. Now, that together is a really important place. But I would love us to go faster and further. As an environmentalist, this matters to me. But I recognise that after the economy was crashed with Liz Truss, there are things that we can't do now that otherwise we would want to do. And I think it is better for us to be honest with people, to say we want to do these things, but we can't afford to do so, and promise what we know we can deliver. Keir wants us to over-deliver on those promises, but it's so much better to take people with us if we're clear about what we can deliver and not over-promise and undeliver.
Just before we move on, should your sister party in Scotland remain partners in government following the decision?
You won't be surprised that I'm not going to answer that question. How can I? It's another political party.
What do you think?
It's for them democratically to decide, is what I think.
Let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Labour is now the true party of English patriotism. I have no time for those who flinch at our flag. The cross of St George belongs to all who love this country. So says Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party. Do you agree with him?
I agree that the flag of St George should belong to all of us. I think that what's very interesting about his article when he says Labour is now the true party of English patriotism is that the whole article throughout it completely confuses when we're talking about Britain and when we're talking about England. And I think that is part of the problem here, that too often there's this elision between England and Britain, and too often that story of England is dominated by those who are cheerleaders for Brexit or imperial nostalgia or exceptionalism. And that's why in my book...
Well, we can show you here. It's actually covered here in politics.co.uk. Caroline Lucas, extremists on the right have hijacked Englishness. The left must reclaim it, as part of your book, Another England. What do you say in response to what Caroline's just said?
Well, I'm proud to be English, and I think it is possible. In fact, actually, most people have multiple identities at the same time. So I identify first and foremost as a Janner. I am proud to be from Plymouth. I'm proud to be English. I'm proud to be British at the same time. And I think within our union across the UK, we can have people that are both Scottish and British at the same time, English and British at the same time. I think Englishness has a unique flavour to it as part of that mix. And I think it's good that Keir and the rest of the Labour Party are setting out that we should be proud of our country. We should be hopeful about things. That doesn't mean we can't critique things that aren't right. We should have that hope that we can get to a better place for everyone in our country, where identities, be it British, English or whatever, are inclusive identities that celebrate the diversity across our country. That, I think, is a better place to be. Because if we don't do this, and this is important, then it's the far right that claim those flags. It's the far right that get to define what does Britishness or Englishness mean. And actually, I think it is about time that the left, indeed that's why Clear is doing this, make that case for Englishness, for Britishness, for patriotism, for pride in where we are, but have that relentless focus on what we could be doing better as well.
Exactly. I mean, recognising that patriotism isn't about saying that your country is better than all other countries, that you love your country, you recognise where it can do better. And one of the things I look at in the book is the difference between Rule Britannia and that kind of sentiment versus Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, what we're talking about there, what Blake was talking about, was building a better England. And that's what's so exciting and inspiring about that poem. So what I'm simply saying in the book really is that the UK itself, its future of it could be in doubt. In a generation, in a generation's time, it's not unbelievable that Scotland could be independent. If you look at things like the demographic changes, for example, in Northern Ireland, we know we now have Michelle O'Neill from Sinn Féin, saying that by 2030 there could be a referendum there on the reunification of Ireland.
So you're trying to anticipate that in a way by trying to get around this issue of identity of being English?
Exactly. I want us to start focusing on what does it mean to be English and how can we make sure that if that happens, the England that we are left with is a country that we can feel proud of and good about, rather than feeling that we don't even have the language to discuss it.
And do you consider people who are nationalistic in Scotland to be as jingoistic as English people who celebrate their history and are patriotic in that regard? Do you put them on a par? Because I just find it interesting, you know, it's St George's Day today. Funnily enough, it's my late mother's birthday. She was very proud to be born on St George's Day, and she loved
Shakespeare as well.
Shakespeare as well. She loved that, and of course
company.
she loved Jerusalem, and it was sang at her funeral. And so she encapsulated sort of born in Yorkshire, all the rest of it. But it's like there seems to have now, and maybe it is that past association with the BNP and others, that being proud of being English has become this negative thing that we would never ascribe to anybody who was in Scotland being proud of being Scottish, or anyone in Wales being proud of being Welsh, or anyone in Northern Ireland being proud of being Northern Irish. And I don't know why there's this sort of feeling of shame. There needs to be some shame associated with celebrating in England's illustrious past. Yeah, like all countries, England got some things wrong, but it got a hell of a lot right. And I don't think it's sort of, you know, unduly, this correlation with Brexit, you know, it's associated with something aggressive. It's not aggressive, it's just celebratory, surely.
Tobias?
Well, firstly, on the nationalism, patriotism, patriotism's good. It's about being positive, and we support Britain, we support England, and wherever you're from. I'm from Dorset area, Thomas Hardy country. Very proud of that, and there's nothing wrong with that. Where I think you're alluding to is nationalism, which actually is not only your love of your own, it's the hate of others, and I think that's negative. That's not good for politics. I am concerned, though, that a political leader will somehow claim Englishness as that sort of title, as the leadership from that. It's actually an amalgam of all of politics here. That's what makes Britain, that's what makes England, and what makes us actually special. What's going on in Scotland and Northern Ireland, there's a proud identity there. My own gut feeling is that people want to remain part of the Union, but also have their own sub-identity as well.
But it's interesting, isn't it, with England, that we don't have those political institutions with which to express that identity. So now in Scotland, you've got the Scottish Parliament, which I think you could say has helped people in Scotland feel a pride in their country and feel a Scottishness. They had it before, obviously, but it's a manifestation of that. And similarly with the Welsh Assembly and so forth, Stormont in Northern Ireland. And it is interesting that here in England, we don't have any institutions to express that Englishness. And then sometimes I think that means that it's even easier then to muddle when we're talking about England, when we're talking about Britain. We assume that what's good for one is good for the other. And I think there could be some benefit in having an English Parliament where we could focus on issues in England and then have Britain as the overarching federal structure, if you like.
All right, well, I think that's a good point to leave it. But thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live. And, of course, it's Prime Minister's Questions tomorrow. So we'll be on air from 11:15 until 1 o'clock. So please do join me then and my guests. But from all of us here, bye-bye.